Hello, my name is Mamie Allen, and I'm an instructor here at Ultimate Medical Academy. Today we'll discuss the nervous system as well as explaining the word structure, meaning taking a closer look at those prefixes, the combining forms, as well as the suffixes. So let's dive in. The nervous system, which is also the brain at its center core, coordinates as well as controls all of our bodily activities. So when the brain ceases to function, the body is no longer able to live on its own. The major structures of the nervous system are the nerves, the brain, spinal cord, as well as sensory organs. The sensory organs would be our eyes, ears, nose, skin, and tongue are discussed in later chapters. Here we have some related combining forms specific to this body system. So we have the structure in the first column, and then related combining forms in the second column. So from here we can see cerebro as well as encephalo identifies the brain, myelo, the spinal cord, and then neuri or neuro will identify the nerves. Keep in mind that letter of O makes it the combining form, whereas the cereb or the encephal will be the root word. But once we add that O, it then becomes a combining form. In this illustration, we can see the nervous system being divided into two primary parts. We have the CNS, which stands for Central Nervous System, and then we have the PNS, which is an abbreviation that stands for the Peripheral Nervous System. So with the CNS, you'll see this located at the top of the screen. This would include our brain and spinal cord. And the function of the CNS would be to receive and process any information as well as regulate all of the bodily activity. Looking at the peripheral nervous system, which is the bottom part of your screen, this would include 12 pairs of our cranial nerves that would extend from our brain, and then we also have 31 pairs of the peripheral spinal nerves that extend outward from our spinal cord. The function of the PNS is to transmit nerve signals to and from the CNS, or we can say the central nervous system. So here we have an illustration of the different spinal nerves. Now, most spinal cord plexuses are named for the corresponding vertebrae. And remember, vertebrae just means the spinal column. So you'll notice these names will correspond to the sections of that spinal column. So we have the cervical plexus here, which would be our C1 through C5. We also have the brachial plexus here within the thoracic area. Moving down, we have the lumbar plexus in our lumbar region, which means back. Then we have the femoral nerve, because that's going into our femur, into the lower extremity. The sacral plexus, which is based off of our sacrum. And then we have the sciatic nerve here at the bottom. Now we're moving on to the nerves of the body system. Now here, a nerve would be one or more bundles of neurons that connect the brain and the spinal cord with other parts of our body. And then a tract is simply a bundle or a group of nerve fibers that are found or located within our brain and spinal cord. Now, with the tract, we have two types. We have an ascending nerve tract, and this carries our nerve impulses toward the brain. And then we also have a descending nerve tract, which would be the opposite, carrying those nerve impulses away from the brain. Other parts of a neuron, we have the ganglion. This would be the nerve center that's made up of a cluster of nerve cells outside of our CNS. When you hear the term ganglion, this would also describe a benign tumor-like cyst. Here, the term innervation means the supply of nerves to a specific body part, as we saw with the various locations of the nerves in our previous slide. Whenever you hear the term plexus, which we saw the different plexuses, this is simply a network of those intersecting spinal nerves. Remember, the plural form of plexus would be plexuses. Plexuscs. This term would also describe a network of intersecting blood or lymphatic vessels. As these nerve signals are transmitted, we have the receptors, which would be the site in our sensory organ that receives that external stimuli. Then it will take that stimuli and send it to the brain for interpretation. Whenever you hear stimuli, or you may hear the term stimulus, this would just be anything that would activate our nerve and causes that impulse to actually occur. Now let's take a look at the specific parts of a neuron. Neurons would be the basic cells of our nervous system that allow the different parts of the body to communicate with one another. Now, within the body, we have billions of neurons. And remember, they're all carrying those nerve impulses throughout our body. And this is occurring through an electrochemical process. In our brain, this process will create a pattern of neuron electrical activity, and this will be known as those brain waves. And these different types of brain waves are produced during periods when we have intense activity, rest, or during sleep. So let's look at these parts a little closer. Now, each neuron will consist of a cell body and then several dendrites, which we see extending here, and then a single axon as well as terminal fibers. Now, when you think of the dendrites, these would be the root-like processes that will receive those impulses and then conduct them to the cell body itself. When you hear the term process, this just means a structure that extends out from our body. Take a look at the next structure, the axon. This will be a process that will conduct impulses away from the nerve cell. An axon is more than 3 feet long. Many, but not all, axons will be protected by this myelin sheath. And you can see here the myelin sheath has a white fatty tissue covering. Next, we have our terminal end fibers, and these would be the branching fibers or the branches at the end of that axon. And this would lead the nerve impulse from the axon to the synapse. So you may be wondering, well, what's a synapse? A synapse is simply the space between the two neurons, or we can say the space between a neuron and a receptor organ. Keep in mind, a single neuron can have a few or it can have several hundred synapses. Here, we also have glial cells, and glial cells provide support and protection for those neurons, and they have 4 main functions. One would be to surround those neurons and keep them in place. 2, to supply nutrients and oxygen to the neurons. 3, to insulate one neuron from the other. And then 4 would be to destroy and remove all dead neurons from the body system. Now, let's take a closer look at that myelin sheath, which is the covering of that neuron. Remember, a myelin sheath would be the protective covering that's made up of those glial cells. This white sheath forms the white matter of the brain and then covers some parts of the spinal cord and the axon of most of our peripheral nerves. Now, the portion of the nerve fibers that are actually myelinated are known as the white matter. The term myelinated means having a myelin sheath. That's pretty easy to remember. Now, the portions of the nerve fibers that are unmyelinated are known as the gray matter. So the term unmyelinated means lacking that myelin sheath. Now keep in mind, the lack of the myelin sheath reveals the brownish gray color of the cortex of the cerebrum as well as the cerebellum and the core of the spinal cord. Now let's move into the brain and spinal cord, which are also parts of our central nervous system. So here, the brain would include our cranium, the skull, and then the spinal cord would include the vertebral column. You may hear it referred to as both. So within our CNS, it is made up of both of these structures. And these structures will protect our bones, as well as the cranium, as well as the vertebrae. Here we can see a cross-section of the brain showing the meninges as well as the protective coverings. You'll also notice that the CSF, or we call that the cerebrospinal fluid, is shown in the color purple. Now take a closer look at the magnified portion here at the top of your page. This is showing you the meninges. Remember, this would be the system of membranes that encloses the brain and the spinal cord. Now, the meninges will have 3 layers of connective tissue, and that's what we're seeing here with this box. Keep in mind, we have the dura mater, we have the arachnoid membrane, and then the pia mater. So let's look at the first, which would be that dura mater. This would be the outermost membrane of the meninges, and it's thick as well as tough. The term dura means hard, and the mater, that M-A-T-E-R, means mother. Take a look at the second portion, the arachnoid membrane. This would resemble a spider web, and it's the second layer of the meninges, and you'll notice it's located between the dura mater and the pia mater. Arachnoid means having to do with spiders, so that's one easy way to memorize that term. Now take a look at the pia mater. The pia mater is the third layer, and this is located nearest the brain and spinal cord. It consists also of connective tissue that contains a rich supply of our blood vessels. The term pia means tender or delicate, where again, mater, that M-A-T-E-R, means mother. We now turn to the parts of the brain. Starting with the cerebrum, this would be the largest and uppermost portion. It's responsible for our thoughts, how we make judgments, our memory, emotions, as well as controlling and integrating our motor and sensory functions. Now note, cerebrum and cerebellum are similar words, but they have very different meanings, and they're very different parts of the brain. Keep in mind, the cerebellum is below the cerebrum. If we were to break this term down, cerebral, this means pertaining to the cerebrum, or we can say pertaining to the brain. The cerebra, the C-E-R-E-B-R, means brain, and the all, that A-L, means pertaining to. Now, if you look at the top portion of the brain, this would be called the cerebral cortex, and this would be made up of gray matter. And again, it's that outer layer of the cerebrum, and it's made up of elevated folds that we'll see. And we call those elevated folds gyri. So the gyri would be those elevated folds of gray matter that you see in the cerebral cortex. And as you can see, that makes up the most of the outermost. The cerebrum can be divided into 2 cerebral hemispheres. We have the left cerebral hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere, and both are connected at the lower midpoint of our corpus callosum. With the left cerebral hemisphere, this will control the majority of our functions on the right side of the body. Any injuries to the left side will cause some sensory as well as motor deficits. Look at the right side, or the right cerebral hemisphere. Of course, controlling functions of our right side, but an injury to this cerebral hemisphere will produce sensory and motor deficiencies on the left side of the body. It's also very important to be able to identify the specific parts or lobes of the brain. And what we see here are some of those lobes. Each cerebral hemisphere you see will be divided to create lobes. Each lobe is named for the bone of the cranium that it covers, so that makes it a little easier to remember. So let's take a look at the frontal lobe, which is here. The frontal lobe will control our skilled motor functions, our memory, as well as our behaviors. Take a look at the parietal, which is here in the color blue. This would receive and interpret those nerve impulses from our sensory receptors in our tongue, our skin, as well as the muscles. Then here in the red, towards the back, we have the occipital lobe, and this controls our eyesight. Get it? Occipital is meaning eye. Then we have the temporal, which is here on the side in the yellow color, and this would be controlling the senses of our hearing as well as smell, and also the ability for us to create, store, and access new information. We now turn to the brainstem, and this is that stalk-like portion of the brain that connects our cerebral hemispheres with our spinal cord. And you'll notice that it's made up of 3 parts. We have the midbrain, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. So let's take a look at each of these parts, starting with the midbrain and the pons. Now, both of these will provide conduction pathways to and from the higher and lower centers in the brain. Both of these will also control our reflexes and movements of our eyes as well as in the head, and this would be in response to any auditory stimuli that we may receive. The term pons is a Latin word that means bridge. Moving on to the medulla oblongata, this is located at the lowest part of our brainstem, and this is connected to our spinal column. Now, it controls our basic survival functions, such as muscles that make possible for breathing, our heart rate, our blood pressure, and again, certain reflexes, such as our coughing, when we must sneeze or swallow or vomit. Our spinal cord, or you may hear it referred to as the vertebral column, is a long, fragile tube-like structure, and it begins at the end of our brainstem and continues down almost to the bottom of the spinal column, ending in our coccyx. Now, the spinal cord will contain all the nerves that affect our limbs and lower part of the body, and it also serves as that pathway for our impulses to travel along. Now, moving into our PNS, or peripheral nervous system. This would consist of the 12 pairs of our cranial nerves that extend from the brain and also those 31 pairs of spinal nerves that extend from the spinal column. Peripheral, if we were to break that down, means pertaining to body parts that are away from the center of the body. We have three types of specialized peripheral nerves, and these types will transmit any signals to and from the CNS. So we have the autonomic nerve fibers, and this will carry instructions to our organs and glands from the autonomic nervous system. We then have the sensory nerve fibers, which is the second type, and this receives external stimuli, such as how something may feel, and then transmit that information to the brain where it can be interpreted. Then we also have our somatic nerve fibers, which are also known as motor nerve fibers, and this would convey any information that controls the body's voluntary muscular movements. Now, the information here you may already recall because we covered this in the previous slide, but remember those peripheral spinal nerves are easy to know because they're based off of the location. So remember, we had the cervical, which would be our C1 through C8, and remember these numbers are referring to the spinal column or that vertebral column. Then we have our thoracic nerves, which would be the T1 through T12. Our lumbar is the L1 through L5, and then the sacral would be S1 through S5. So just remember, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral as far as naming those different nerves. We now turn to our cranial nerves, and you'll notice here that the cranial nerves has a Roman numeral listed with it, and they're also named for the area as well as the function that they perform. So we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves that originate from under the surface of our brain. The two nerves of a pair would be identical in function and structure, and each nerve of a pair serves half of the body. Now, these cranial nerves are identified again by Roman numerals and makes it easier for memorization. So taking a look at some of the names, you can see it's related to the actual structure itself. We have the olfactory, Roman numeral 1, for the nose. We have the optic, which is the sensory nerve for the eye. Then we have the oculomotor, which controls the muscles of the eye. Moving on to the trigeminal sensory, this will control the muscles within our face, our sinuses, teeth. And then also we have facial nerves for the muscles of our face. Moving on here, we have the hypoglossal, which controls the muscles within the tongue. The accessory would be our sternocleidomastoid, and that's referring to that middle section of the chest area, as well as our trapezius muscles. And then we also have the vagus motor, and this would send signals to our hearts, lungs, the bronchi, which is within the lungs, and our gastrointestinal tract, which has to do with our intestines. We also have nerves for the glossopharyngeal, which would have to do with our pharynx. And then we have the vestibulocochlear, I should say, which has to do with the ear and those auditory functions. We now move into those medical specialties that may be related to the nervous system, meaning what type of physician would treat conditions of our nervous system. So we have a couple. We have an Anesthesiologist, and this would be a physician who specializes in administering those anesthetic agents before and also during surgery. If we were to break down this term, an is meaning without, esthesi, the ESTHESI is meaning filling or with filling, and then the ologist simply means specialist, and I think we've seen ologist before probably. We also have a neurologist, and this would be a physician who would specialize in diagnosing and treating those diseases of our nervous system. If we were to break that medical term down, neur, the N-E-U-R, means nerve, and the ologist, again, would mean specialist. We also have a neurosurgeon, and this would be a physician who specializes in the surgery of the nervous system. Again, neuro meaning nerve, and surgeon is an easy one, a surgeon. Within the nervous system, as with our other body systems, there are also some pathological conditions that may be present and need treating. A few of those are listed here. We see we have the head and meninges, but within that we have the term cephalgia, and cephalgia simply means a headache, but cephalgia is the medical term for that. If we were to break cephalgia down, the CEPHL means head, and then the algia, that ALGIA, is meaning pain. So when we put those together, it would mean pain within the head or headache. Take a look at a migraine headache. Most times this will be accompanied by the feeling of nauseousness, vomiting, as well as some sensitivity to light and sound. Then when we have those cluster headaches, this would repeatedly affect one side of the body, and the name is given because it occurs in a cluster. Now, as we conclude from today's lesson, you were shown different medical terms relating to our nervous system. Now, I'll see you in part 2. Thanks for joining today.